There are far more books that we can read than we have the time to read them. And so I want to talk about why book DNF is on my mind and why you should embrace not finishing more books in 2025. And it's important to consider this no matter where you are on your journey and what books you're currently reading or what you have on your to read list still, because as we get older, we start to realize that we have less and less of that free time to spend reading or acquiring new skills. And it becomes even more important on what books you're going to read and what books you're not going to read or you're not going to finish. And so here are a couple of the ways that I'm strategizing DNF and when I'm not going to finish a book and move on from it. And at the end of this video, I'm going to go through my Kindle and look at some of the titles that shockingly I didn't finish and likely won't go back to at least anytime soon. And if you're like me, you're somebody that reads every book that you get cover to cover. I see this becoming even more of a problem with trying to finish every book that we start, because every year more and more great books come out and that list just stacks up even more. So our time is short, and some of our favorite authors continue to publish more winners every year that add to that to be read list and just cause it to stack up. And the other issue that's causing this is that the accessibility of books has just become so fast and so instant that if there's something you want to read, you can instantly add it to your Kindle or an e-reader or even just your phone and download an e-reader app and start reading it immediately. You can get the samples off of Amazon or any other bookstore and start to read it, which just immerses us into more and more books and more options in the blink of an eye. You know, when reading a book or choosing a book was a more slow and deliberate process of having to go to the bookstore or wait in line at the library until somebody else had finished checking it out and returned it, it was a lot simpler to manage that to be read list, as well as choosing whether to finish a book that we've committed to or not. So the first rule that I have to deciding if you should DNF a book is, did you get the joke? I learned this one from Seth Godin, who is a great author himself, somebody that I like to read a lot of his books, but he's also been in the book publishing world for a long time. And so people send him books all the time to read. So if you understand the punchline or the joke, the main point of the book, and you don't think that you need to go any deeper into it, that's a good time to DNF it. Now, this is something that I think is common with self-help books or in business books, because it often is that main core thesis. And maybe if you've listened to a couple of podcasts with that author before, you might really understand what their main talking points are, because they've rehearsed those a lot for those podcast interviews to promote the book itself. But that leads me into my next point, which I think is also useful when considering, did you get the main point or did you get the joke of the book? And that is flip to the most useful part. So if you understand the core thesis of the book, and then you find whichever section is most relevant or useful for what you need to know about the book, that can be another reason to not go through, and read it cover to cover. And all of the other sections, maybe there are a lot of refresher sections that are more basic, and you're just trying to get into the details that are most useful for you. These rules so far have been mostly for nonfiction books, which is what I spend the majority of my time reading. That's why I think about these DNF rules or what gets even on my to be read list in the first place. But if you're reading more fiction or wanting to know how to decide if it's a DNF for you that's a fiction book or just like a novel that you're getting into, and even for nonfiction, the next rule is the 100 minus your age rule. And I've heard this from many different places. I know Ryan Holiday talks about it a lot as well. And this idea is basically take your age, 100 minus your age is how many pages into a book you should allow yourself before you decide whether it's a DNF or not. The advantage is when we're younger, we're still refining our tastes and getting a better sense of what books are worth reading and diving into, and which ones we should cut ties with early on. As we get older and this number starts to decline, it means that a book really has less time to win you over and capture your attention before you commit to reading it. And so this is another good rule that you can use for any type of book, but especially if you're finding that within, the first 70, 80 pages of a fiction novel that you're reading, it hasn't won you over, it's probably something that's not worth finishing. And then my next rule is to pick your virtual mentors carefully. And I've always liked to think of the authors that we read in books or people that we hear on podcasts or on videos online as virtual mentors. We're not interacting in person, face to face with them and treating them as a real mentor that we're learning directly from. But you can absorb so much wisdom and information from the right mentors through their writing and the efforts that they put into creating content for you. And this is something that's an amazing part of reading and deep reading, as well as just, the developments for the online world and how many different access points we have towards people online. But the point here with picking your mentors carefully is that we simply can't follow every single person. If you've got a list of 100 plus podcasts to listen to like me, you'll realize that you've got to limit your choices to a few key mentors or a few key thought leaders that have your attention at the moment. We'll go through phases in life where we start to shift away from one person, pick up the ideas and influence of somebody else, and eventually kind of find our own path and hopefully have people that we want to share and mentor as well. But trying to follow everybody and understand every point of view at the deepest level just doesn't work. And so I like to limit myself to a couple of those virtual mentors that I'm really diving deep into and understanding their main points. Going back to that Seth Godin idea, getting their joke. And once I understand their joke, once I understand their point of view, I can then decide to continue and go deeper on that path or find a different virtual mentor to dive into, maybe read their full collection of books or go into their podcasts or video library and consume as much as possible to develop a deeper understanding from that one aspect or that one point of view. For me, some of these authors look like Tim Ferriss, who I will always pick up his books and read them whenever they come out, just because he's one of the first that influenced me into liking nonfiction and business writing in the first place. Or Brad Stulberg and Steve Magnus with Peak Performance and their Growth Equation series. They both have co-written books as well as their individual books. I know Steve, I just got in the mail Win the Inside Game yesterday. It just arrived for me, and that's going to be one of the next ones that I start to read. Cal Newport, I always pre-order and get his books when they come in. And there are a couple of authors that are like this for me. Or, I'm diving deep into their podcasts for a season and then going into the books that they've written. So I think this is an important way to decide not only what to DNF, but which books you choose to read and to go deeply into. And if they fall outside of those virtual mentors for you, have higher standards of deciding when to cut ties with it or not, if it's not fully captivating your attention or teaching you something extremely valuable. So now to wrap this video up and to illustrate the point that there are lots of books that I DNF, and because they are so accessible on a Kindle or e-reader, I find that I pick up way more books than I ever end up finishing, and it becomes sometimes overwhelming not only to decide what to read, but to decide what to cut ties with or to stop reading. I wanted to go through and kind of see some of the books that I have not finished lately just to kind of illustrate, it is useful and a good idea when something hasn't fully captivated you or it's not what you need to learn at the moment to not finish reading it. One that stands out, which I did actually go in and finish reading, but it took many years, was Creativity by Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. When I first read this, I actually found it to be kind of dry and uninteresting. And I'm really glad that I started it back up last year and read the whole thing through. And I found it much more interesting this time compared to probably 5 or 6 years ago when I first tried to read it. Another one that I kind of got started with the first few pages of is Unreasonable Hospitality. After watching The Bear, I was interested in checking this one out and never actually got into it. I think I will finish reading this one at some point, but it's not been the most pressing thing to learn or the most important skill to develop for myself at the moment. Another DNF for me was Draft Number 4 by John McPhee. This is one that I've heard Tim Ferriss talk about as an important one about the writing process. It is really good and quite interesting, but I wasn't directly applying the writing skills or information in there. And so it wasn't as relevant or as useful to me as I kind of thought it was going to be. And I will probably go back to that one at some point. But for now, that's another DNF. Another example that I think is a good one to illustrate some of the points we talked about on choosing the main areas or sections of a book that are most relevant to you is Peak. This is one by Dr. Mark Bubbs. He's a naturopathic doctor who wrote this book on athletic performance and peak performance. There are some really good sections in there and useful sections on things like sports nutrition for fueling for endurance competitions, things like that, as well as a lot of mindset training and information there. That was something that I felt like I had a good grasp on. I never really read through fully that section on mindset, and some of the training and performance ones were a lot of rehashing of things that I already knew really well. So I got those main punchlines and just found some other areas quite interesting. So I kind of jumped to those sections, and rather than reading it fully, that's one that landed on my DNF list. And then one more that I'll mention for now is The Diary of a CEO. This is one that I thought I was going to find interesting, and it kind of fits some of these criteria. It didn't totally capture my attention enough to keep me hooked in and wanting to continue to read. And I wouldn't classify Stephen Bartlett as one of those virtual mentors for me. He's somebody I've listened to a couple of his podcast episodes. I like his Diary of a CEO podcast, although it's not one that I regularly turn to unless he's got a guest on that I haven't heard from lately or that I want to listen to. Like, I know he had a good conversation with Simon Sinek, but this book and his content is not in my classification as one of my virtual mentors. And this is one that landed squarely in my DNF list in the past year. So those are my thoughts on why you should embrace book DNF and not finishing the books that just don't capture your attention or aren't teaching you anything really useful for skill development. And so this has been something that's been on my mind going into 2025. And I think it just becomes more and more of an issue the more accessible books are with digital reading, as well as just authors continuing to publish excellent books that I constantly want to read and pick up. It's always on my mind on when do you cut ties with books? And so I think it's important to consider and help share some of those thoughts. And I'd love to know what your thoughts are on this. When do you decide to DNF a book? What are the rules or criteria for you? Or are you somebody who cover to cover reads a book once you start it? Let me know in the comments below, and I will see you in the next video.